Wonderful. Going to start. Hello again, and welcome to Redesigning AI for Shared Prosperity. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Katya Klinova. I'm the head of Labor and Economy Programs at the Partnership on AI. So excited to welcome you on this celebratory moment for us. This month, we're celebrating the AI and Shared Prosperity Initiative Turning One, and we're gathered with terrific champions of this work, who I'll introduce momentarily. We'll reflect on the work of the past year, we'll share future plans, and we'll also give away some gifts to our community. It is mid-2021, and we're finding ourselves in what will hopefully become a turning point in many ways. It is becoming commonly understood that not all technologies equally deserve to be called progress, that sometimes introduction of new technologies genuinely lifts all boats in the economy, and other times it generates benefits that are privatized by a narrow group and imposes costs that are socialized a lot more broadly. Speakers who are joining us today are among the leaders who ushered the arrival of this moment. They recognize the uneven nature of technology's economic impacts. They have pointed out that the cost of innovation is often borne by workers and their communities, and they have been calling for a different approach. Inspired by their work and their ideas, we founded the AI and Shared Prosperity Initiative a year ago to ask, how can AI by design be made to serve the prosperity of working people who are so frequently expected to be left behind? 1 year later, we are here to share ideas on how to answer this question and invite our community to join in on our work to refine and implement those ideas. Being a partnership, we did not spend this year working by ourselves. We collaborated with the Boston Review, who brought together 20 leading thinkers to help highlight the multiple facets of this problem from different points of view. The result is this beautiful book, which we'll be delighted to mail to people who send us interesting questions today. So please do submit your questions in the Q&A button, which you can find below your screen, and do sign your name so we can contact you and mail you the book. We also convened a steering committee of 24 partners from across the industry, academia, civil society, and the labor movement. With incredibly generous guidance and support of the steering committee, we put together an agenda for redesigning AI for shared prosperity. It is our plan of research and action that we hope many of you will join us to implement. And I'm very, very excited and grateful that 3 of the members of our esteemed steering committee, who are also 3 of the authors of the Boston Review book, are here today to discuss the book and the shared prosperity agenda with us. Let me introduce them. Lama Nachman is an Intel Fellow and the Director of the Human and AI Research Lab at Intel Labs. Welcome, Lama. Ryan Gerety is Senior Advisor at United for Respect, where she focuses on the economic and political implications of new technology. Welcome, Ryan. And Daron Acemoglu is Institute Professor at MIT. He is co-author with James Robinson of The Narrow Corridor, States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty, as well as Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty. Welcome, Daron, and welcome, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us today. Before we dive into the conversation with the steering committee members and into the audience questions, let me briefly turn it over to Stephanie Bell, the AI and Shared Prosperity Initiative's Research Fellow, to give you all an overview of the Shared Prosperity Agenda's main proposal. Stephanie, it is over to you.
Hi, everybody. Very excited to be here today. Just going to quickly give an overview of the initiative, as Katya mentioned, before we get into the discussions from the panelists and the audience questions. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here to get into the presentation. So as Katya mentioned, we've just released the agenda for the Shared Prosperity Initiative, which is called Redesigning AI for Shared Prosperity. It's both an action plan as well as a research plan. It offers a series of ambitious goals for what we hope to achieve with this effort, as well as a series of ideas about how we might be able to get there from where we stand now. We talk about what needs to occur from the angle of different stakeholders, and we also go over the evidence base for the initiative, which actually leads me into the next slide, which is about the Shared Prosperity Initiative's ground truths. So this initiative really emerges from three ground truths. The first is that AI is going to exacerbate the polarization of the labor market if we leave it on the path that it's currently on. And that polarization takes place across a number of different angles. Most importantly, from the sort of angle of whether or not jobs are going to get automated and whether there are going to be new jobs in sufficient numbers created for people to be able to take in their stead, as well as whether those jobs are actually going to be of any quality. There's also polarization that will likely take place across skill divisions, which we're already seeing, and also geographic boundaries. The areas where AI is currently being created are likely to see much more economic gain than the areas where jobs are being automated by that AI. The second ground truth is that AI can be steered in economically inclusive directions. So right now, AI is currently being built in a lot of ways that are not intended or not directionally going to produce inclusivity, especially for low wage and vulnerable workers within the United States as well as around the world. But those aren't the only paths that are possible for AI. We propose intentionally steering AI in a direction that's more inclusive. And finally, workers themselves are critical for productively shaping AI development. They are themselves the best sources of expertise on their jobs, on the roles that they perform, on the skills and the tasks that they complete. And seeking their input and offering them opportunities for participation that are empowered and equitable is going to be one of the best ways to create that economically inclusive version of AI. So I think I've given you a little bit of a chance to understand what the goal of this might be, which is to create an abundance of good jobs for all kinds of workers. We're talking about workers of all skill profiles, workers of all demographics, workers across all geographies. The big question, though, is how do we think we're going to get there? So our proposal at the Partnership on AI and for this initiative is to create shared prosperity targets. And you can think about these as being somewhat similar to carbon neutral targets or carbon negative targets. What we're trying to do here is to create something that is measurable, that companies can make commitments to, and that's going to ultimately result in the expansion of good jobs across the economy. And it's worth noting that much like carbon neutrality, this is something where companies could choose to voluntarily commit to meeting these targets and setting them, but there also could be regulatory encouragement. So what might these targets involve? We think that there are three components that are critical to making these targets successful. The first is that we take a look at labor income. This involves taking a look at questions of job availability. It also looks at job compensation. The question here is, are workers able to get jobs that pay them well? A sort of subsidiary question to this is, what are workers getting from the work that they're producing relative to the sort of capitalists or corporations that are paying them to do these jobs? To the extent that AI produces a radical amount of inequality between those two groups, we would argue that it's headed in the wrong direction. Second, there's questions of job quality. Right now, we're mostly focused on questions of worker power as well as worker well-being. Do workers have the opportunity to offer input into the technologies that are introduced into their workplaces? Are their concerns taken seriously? Is their dignity respected? Do they have the opportunities to be able to voice those concerns without fear of punishment or retribution? And are these technologies actually increasing their well-being on the job, or at the very least not making it worse? We see so many technologies that are being created at this point that are not focused on workers' needs, and as a result, are degrading the experiences of workers in workplaces. We argue that there's a better path for AI. Finally, we wouldn't be doing our job if we didn't take into account the potentially unequal distribution of these better jobs across the global economy. I think there's a couple of categories that we're particularly concerned with here. The first are skills requirements. We want to make sure that workers are able to earn a living wage regardless of what skills or formal credentials they bring to the table. The second is geographic location. We want to make sure that the AI that's being created doesn't create radically inequitable impacts across different geographies or across different geographic boundaries. And then finally, across demographics. If what occurs is that we're creating a bunch of good jobs for a very specific group of workers at the expense of other workers, we'll have considered the targets to have been a failure in terms of their design. So each of these is a consideration as we move forward to the stage in which we're considering the development of these targets. So the agenda that we referenced earlier, which is available on our website, first starts by laying out the introduction and the guiding assumptions. Second, we talk about the shared prosperity targets, as well as a blueprint for their implementation. How is it that we're going to be able to create these targets? what needs to be involved, and how do we make sure that they're designed in a way that companies are going to be able to implement them successfully. Finally, we take a look at each of the different stakeholders who are necessary to be able to make this project a success. We take a look at workers, unions, and worker organizations, and what they bring to the table in terms of their expertise and their knowledge, as well as what they're able to benefit, how they can benefit as a result of this work. Second, we take a look at the private sector, AI developers, AI deployers, as well as investors and tech workers. Each of these groups has an opportunity to shape the trajectory of AI, though we understand that there are counter forces that they are going to have to potentially fight against in order to get there. We take a look at national governments and the ways in which they'll be able to support the creation of this AI, as well as the ways in which they'll be able to support workers through our transitions to increasingly advanced technologies. And then finally, we take a look at international organizations, civil society, and educational institutions. We've seen successes of organizations such as these collaborating across geographic boundaries to be able to achieve successes for social justice and for equity across the world. We think they'll play a critical part in this work as well. Before handing back to Katya and to the panel that I'm sure you all are very excited to see, we wanted to quickly take a moment to thank the members of our steering committee. As Katya mentioned, we had 24 different steering committee members who were contributing to the work on the Shared Prosperity Initiative. The work that we completed would not have been able to be nearly so successful or so thorough, nor would have been been able to incorporate so many different perspectives without the guidance of these leaders across different sectors of society. We had leaders from the nonprofit sector, we had leaders from academia, as well as leaders from industry. Each of these steering committee members helped us achieve where we are now, and we're very excited to be able to share more about it. So back to Katya to introduce the panels.
Stephanie, thank you so very much. Very excited to dive into the conversation now, and we've been receiving questions already, and please keep them coming through the Q&A button. So I want to begin by really unpacking the difference between what is worker replacing AI, worker augmenting AI, the phrase that has been gaining a lot of usage lately, as well as worker exploiting AI, and where does the boundary lie between what we can call worker augmenting and productivity boosting AI and AI that enables exploitation and employer outreach. So Daron, you've introduced the term Soso technologies. Could you please tell us about Soso technologies and how they're different from the brilliant technologies? How, by the look of it, how can we differentiate? And what is the risk that the spread of Soso AI poses to the domestic economy in the US, but especially to the low and middle income economies around the world?
Thank you, Katya. I think the first important observation, which you have already emphasized and Stephanie already emphasized, is that there are many choices when it comes to technology. We can use technology for different things in different ways, and different types of technologies have very distinct implications. So when Pascual Restrepo and I talk of Soso automation, what we have in mind are things like self-checkout kiosks that automate work, save some costs for companies, but do not significantly increase productivity or improve customer experience. Nobody thinks that self-checkout kiosks are going to revolutionize retail. Often they create additional work for the customers themselves. They are not cheap technologies, but they are very popular because at the margin, they save a little bit of cost. They enable firms to get by with fewer workers, and often firms actually get subsidies for introducing these types of machines by using various depreciation allowances and other things that make capital investments very beneficial for firms. If the future of technology is going to be more and more like the self-checkout kiosks, it's not a bright future. It's not going to improve productivity greatly. One of the enormous challenges we have in many developed economies is that when you look on paper, we have a lot of innovations, new patents, new widgets, new algorithms, but productivity doesn't seem to grow. But if we put all of our energy in things like self-checkout kiosks that are not really superbly increasing productivity, we're not going to really get the productivity dividends. But it's also a double whammy for the workers. They get displaced from their jobs, and because productivity is not increasing much, demand for labor in non-automated tasks doesn't grow much either. So it's a lose-lose proposition for workers. But this is really the top tip of the iceberg. Your question hinted at exploitative technologies. We are not just doing Soso automation, we're also doing lots of other technologies that are directly targeted at reducing labor costs, even if it's not very good for labor. So if we use AI for monitoring workers, that might be profitable for firms, quite expensive sometimes, but obviously not very good for workers. So there are a whole bunch of ways in which we can use new technologies, and especially AI, which is a very broad technological platform. And we have a lot of choices as companies, society at large, government policy, what types of technologies we are going to develop out of this platform, how we're going to use the capabilities afforded to us by AI. And this choice is critically important because, as my brief answer highlights, how much productivity gain we're going to get out of it depends on that. But even more importantly, who is going to benefit? More inequality, less inequality. And even more importantly, in my opinion, the future of work. Are we going to have a two-tiered work structure where a small fraction make all the meaningful contributions and gain all the income and all the social status? The rest is dispensable, or a much more equitable shared prosperity generating work structure? All of these depend on our choices. And Soso technologies, monitoring technologies, and other ways of using AI for capital or the benefit of a small segment of society go in the direction of that two-tiered work structure.
Thank you. Yeah, I would love to dive into these technological choices. Lama, you've been talking a lot about that. Like, you've actually been one of the most outspoken technological leaders who's been talking about the limitations of automation-only approach and the gains that are foregone when we are overwhelmingly focusing on that in AI research and development. Could you speak a little bit more about what those limitations are and what is there to be explored in the human-AI collaboration that is not being really tapped sufficiently enough?
Sure. So if you look at really kind of the progress recently with AI, and specifically as we started to see really deep learning starting to show, in some specific tasks, human level accuracies, right? Whether you're talking about things like object recognition or speech recognition, et cetera. There is this kind of fascination with, let's go figure out how to replicate this human capability and bring, essentially if you can continue to scale that notion, you could start to think about, okay, we're really on this path to actually replace humans in many of the tasks that humans can do, hence, improving the productivity to perform these tasks. But if you actually think about it, right, when we're kind of engaged in work, there is a whole workflow to what we do. And you can think about the specific small portion of that work that's obviously repetitive, that we can go and collect tons of data, create quickly a model, put it out there, and then kind of have the human not have to do this part of that task. But in some sense, it's like a very, very limited way of looking at the opportunity in the space. Because if you think about it, humans and AI are good at very different things, right? I mean, humans are really extremely good at being able to learn from very limited data, work in very ambiguous situations, extract sometimes connections of things that they've never seen before, right? Because they could see patterns in a very different way than machines can. But machines, on the other hand, and specifically AI, can actually process tons of data, very multidimensional data, be able to find things that are very hard for humans to go do. So logically, if you think about capabilities that are so diverse in nature, right, it makes much more sense to say, well, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? What is the task that, what is the complete workflow? And how do we bring actually those capabilities together to build a system that is collaborative in nature that can get to these much better results? And there, to Daron's point earlier, we get stuck in trying to automate these small pieces, and we kind of lose the much larger piece on that innovation that actually needs to happen to enable these very diverse systems to work well together, right? And there are, the other thing that I see very often is that we have this tendency to go try to automate the things that we can automate, because we know all of the brittle nature of AI and where it fails and how costly it is to continue to maintain it, how energy inefficient it is to train, all of these different things, right? But when we think about the kind of the total cost of ownership and the total productivity benefit, when we're going after these specific narrow opportunities, we kind of miss the larger point, right? Because there are costs all over the place as a result of just trying to bring that automation to that place. And when we think about that operating model, we don't think about all of the other pieces that actually are, as a result, bringing that extra cost or lack of overall benefit, really. So it ends up being very marginal in many of the cases, because we know what we're limited by with AI, and we're trying to kind of take that very, very tiny piece and try to automate it. And in many times, it's like that really requires a much deeper engagement with people who are performing these tasks and thinking about those whole workflow, to think about what would a capability like this bring to the table for them to enable them to be more productive and do their job better and have a much better experience doing it, right? And if you're able to do that, the benefits are so much higher, right? But it's much harder to do because you're bringing kind of different types of skill set and expertise and knowledge. And many times even where the cost gets spent, right, and under what it gets built, sometimes drives optimizations that are not looking at that from a complete end-to-end flow perspective.
Yeah, thank you. So Ryan, I want to ask you about this, because what Lama is describing is really this enlightened AI, when researchers embed themselves with workers and observe them to understand how to really help to make the job better and augment the productivity. But what you're seeing in your work is also a lot of what you call, which I love that term, productivity pushing. It's the kind of technology that markets itself as worker augmenting and as productivity boosting, but really it enables exploitation, it enables over surveillance and such forms of uses. So from the point of view of the society and the policymakers, what is the way to differentiate between the two? Where is the line stands between technology that genuinely helps and complements workers and technology that helps exploitation flourish in the workplace?
Thank you, Katya, and thanks to everybody here, and thanks for your question. Just to say, my insights on this are drawn from the experience of many dozens of workers in retail and in warehousing who've spoken out and organized and spoken to me about their experience. What Daron points out is that we're really facing a choice here. And what Lama is highlighting is sort of the high road of that choice. What we're seeing in most workplaces today is that tech is really taking advantage, that corporations are using tech in workplaces to take advantage of very weak labor laws that we have all around the world, but particularly in the United States, which is where I'm focused, to further exploit their leverage over workers. So just, and as an example, Amazon warehouses and logistics drivers have become a sort of canonical example. And I'll just explain briefly because I think it's helpful. In the warehouses, when you scan items, Amazon obviously has a record of the number of items that are scanned per hour. It also then has a record of how long it's taken you from going from one task to another task. And so it can time whether or not you've taken longer than it thinks you should to perform a task. And that becomes something called time off task. Every minutes that you've spent that are considered extra are accumulated and collected. And then, you know, by the way, the scanner tells you to go from one area to the next area. So this system, which workers call rate and time off task, is then used to discipline and eventually fire workers if they can't keep up. And as a result, we see that the turnover rate at Amazon is quite high, and that injuries and the levels of anxiety are above injury standards. So I think there's like, if we looked at this system as an example, there's a few things to pull away from. One, it's this AI is about, it's not AI, but this technological system is about enforcing a pace of work. So it's setting an arbitrarily high quota, which, you know, surprise, an employer can do that currently in the US. That's pushing workers, you know, 10-hour shifts every second of the shift. It's punitive, meaning that the end result is about discipline and termination, as opposed to, you know, helping a worker correct their task or something along those lines. And that overall workers have very little autonomy and control throughout their day. So they're spending 10 hours a day being constantly micromanaged. And we know that when workers have less control over work, we see higher injuries, we see anxiety, we see depression. And like Daron said, you know, these are very small gains that are made by pushing workers to their absolute physical limits. It's enabled Amazon to have, you know, 1 and 2 day shipping. Other employers, of course, are copying these methods or developing similar methods. But the consequences to the workers, and I would argue sort of broadly in the economy, are extremely high, but it's not accounted for in our policy regimes, which are really de facto incentivizing this kind of low road innovation where workers are like physically being squeezed, or where you see their hours like minimized to the absolute possible, you know, every break is counted against them, or where the turnover and precarity is extremely high. So I'd say the good news is we don't have to look specifically at the technologies. I think we don't have to regulate each sort of instance or each kind of technology, because the real gap is the sort of weak labor laws that we have and the lack of voice that workers have in their workplace. We have very low unionization rates, but I think critically, the lack of voice working people have in economic decisions in our policies as compared to large corporations. And so if you set a robust set of rights, which, you know, should include set of rights around data and technology, but also around at-will employment, around misclassification, around wages, tax policies, which I think we'll get into later, I think we would start to see more of the innovations that Lama is talking about and less of these really low road innovations, which our public policies currently incentivize.
Thank you, Ryan. These are really memorable stories that just like stay with me. I wanted to ask you all, this is a question that kind of gets a lot of discussion, and it often feels inconclusive or unsatisfactory. So is it about the AI, or is it about the institutions? Like, is it fair to think of AI as neutral? Because you can be, you know, in the warehouses, we've seen you can be using technology to protect workers from the spread of COVID-19, or you can be using the same technology to create a very overly punitive environment that discipline workers the moment there is a distancing requirement that is violated. So is it about the technological choices, or is it about the practices in the workplace that have already been exploited for many decades, that this technology is now rolled over, and what needs to change there, or maybe both? Whoever
if
wants
I could say a few things on that, because I think my answer to that will be built very much on what Ryan said. almost everything that we are doing with AI right now is not new. We've been doing them in various forms for 200 years. Ryan pointed out the use of AI for better monitoring to squeeze workers' labor out in a potentially more exploitative and more lucrative way for companies. Well, Jeremy Bentham came up with the idea of the panopticon, almost 200 years ago, more than 150 years ago, in order to provide a better monitoring environment in factories. So what AI often does is that it provides greater flexibility for things that we were sometimes able to do more clumsily before. But in that way, I think, again, coming back to my most important emphasis, of course, AI is not neutral, as opposed to what you often hear from the luminaries of Silicon Valley. There isn't a path of technology that's preordained, or technology wants that we should just pursue this path that either is already set, that we should just follow, or that they know what the best path is. I think there are many different choices that we make with every technology, and especially with AI. And many of those choices right now are being made not by a diverse set of voices, but by a small group of people without much accountability. And worse, many of those choices are actually bad choices. They are not good for productivity for the reasons that Lama and Ryan also mentioned. They have tremendous distributional consequences. And they also risk creating a very lopsided future of work. So it is particularly important in this juncture to realize that technology is neither neutral nor in any sense preordained. So there's a lot for us to worry about and to work towards for improving the direction of technology.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add as well, I mean, I totally agree with that. And I would add as well, in addition to the fact that it's adaptable and more flexible, its scale, to deploy it at scale is much easier, right? So the impact that you can have as a result of that just inherent scalability in this technology makes the impact of it so much higher, right? And I think that's why it's just kind of at a totally different level. If we kind of think about this in maybe some other way, you can, to answer your question of whether it is really the technology or is it the way that it's used and exploited. I mean, I would say there are kind of two, I would say both, right? Because in some sense, if we think about building these AI technologies, there are parts of it that is really kind of much more general in nature that can be applied to all sorts of problems. And you could actually think about really logical and beneficial usages of these AI capabilities that are being put out. And you can think of really bad usages of these technologies, right? But when you're thinking at the capability level, sometimes it's really hard to say. I mean, you're kind of doing something with an intended use in mind, and then it gets misused in all sorts of different ways. But also, when we're actually building AI technologies, a lot of time we're thinking throughout this whole experience, right? We're building an end user application. We're building something that's very specific. And there we have way much more agency and capability to think through what is right and what is not right, right? What are the harms? Looking at, an impact assessment of that technology and bringing the right voices to the table to analyze this, right? I mean, just because we can make something happen, it doesn't mean we should, right? And I think part of the problem is that if you look at the speed by which AI has been, or AI development has been increasing, who are those voices at the table, right? How are you ensuring that you're bringing multidisciplinary expertise together to think through these different harms and impacts? And yes, you might have one idea of it, but you could actually absolutely see what the impact is if, you know, if it gets exploited in a different way. These are the conversations that need to happen, right? Those, every time we engage in a project in, you know, Silicon Valley or whatever that project is, we need to bring all the right voices to the table to look at that impact assessment, right? And ask the question, should we do it? And if we should do it, how should we do it? And what do we need to put in place to ensure that we're being very responsible about making it happen? And I think that starts to reduce a lot of that risks that's associated with this work.
So maybe I'll just add a few layers onto this. You know, by the way, Daron mentioned Bentham, who developed the sort of idea of a panopticon in factories. That was also used to develop prisons. And I think that sort of should hint us toward the punitive nature of these kinds of continuous monitoring and control technologies that, you know, enforce control both in a prison, enforce control in a factory. He and his brother developed these ideas together as they were looking at factories, and we're looking at prisons, and we're looking at poorhouses, and we sort of see the same logic replicate itself. I think I'd also like to pull in another thinker from the 1800s, Charles Babbage, who's widely known in partnership with Ada Lovelace to be sort of the first computer scientists, the first programmers before there were computers. And something I learned recently about him is that he wrote a whole book about manufacturing and optimizing manufacturing, in addition to, you know, the sort of things I learned about him as an early programmer when I was studying computer science. And in reading his like very old book on manufacturing, it's sort of clear this logic of computer science or computation or sort of systemizing things. When applied to the workplace, he even hints that this could have a terrible impact on the workers. He sort of upfront says this could have this kind of complete control in order to minimize wages, by the way, could have a negative social impacts. But then he goes on as like, I guess, a good engineer to like lay out the ways that you would do it anyways. And I think we're seeing, you know, this is the early 1800s, you're seeing very similar things happening now. And I think it's why it's important that we don't think about this as like a choice that we can bend, you know, computer scientists or individual corporations to, because when, you know, as Lama said, we're talking about the seat at the table, we live in a democracy where the rules of the economy should be determined by what is the public good and determined by the public voice. And so that's the kind of choice that we have to make. We have to change the rules so that we see different sorts of innovations. And this question of whether AI is neutral, I think, you know, is a little bit misleading, right? Because you're always implementing something within an existing power structure and system. And, you know, corporations have rules and their objective is to maximize profits. And so they'll maximize profits as determined by those rules. And we can shift those rules to get better outcomes. And I would just add to what Lama was saying about the way technology is special, but it's both the scale, and I would add also that it formalizes sort of rulemaking. When you see AI deployed, say in the criminal justice system by the courts, it's formalizing a kind of rule within the code. And that makes it a little bit different than like other kinds of innovations we would see. So I'll just end there.
Thank you. I'd love to turn us to hopefully an optimistic you know, view of how can we do better. This is a question we got from the chat, asking how can the high road that Lama is describing be incentivized? And also, Lama, I am fascinated by, you know, you alluded in your Boston Review essay that actually building AI that genuinely complements human, that's a harder research problem. So could you explain in which ways it is more difficult and what's missing? What kind of investment is missing? How can we catalyze it and get more of it happening?
Yeah. So I mean, if you think about, maybe a good analogy is thinking about how humans collaborate, right? If you're trying to actually have two people collaborate, there is a lot of understanding and contextual understanding that needs to happen to enable for that to be efficient, right? I mean, people have to have a shared understanding of what each other are doing, understand each other's actions, intents, be able to interact effectively in the context of that shared work that they're doing, right? Not um, not like today how we interact with an Alexa or a chatbot or whatever, right? I mean, just imagine if you actually wanted to do work without having that deeper understanding and an ability to even understand how someone is thinking about it and predicting what they might be doing next and effectively do that. We as humans do this very easily, right? We pick up on subtle movements and gestures and nonverbal communication and all of that stuff that enables us to actually do this type of collaborative work much more efficiently. Now, contrast that with now a human and AI system that's trying to do that, right? And that really kind of underlines the big research challenge here, because there are issues around how do you effectively understand human state. You know, the AI system has to do that, right? It has to be able to predict some of these intents. It has to be able to interact effectively in that shared context and understand references without, you know, having everything be spelled out in that communication. Like all of these different hurdles that today, if you look at just building a chatbot that's coherent, that's multimodal in nature, is a very hard problem, right? So now add to it all of these different pieces that I was talking about, in addition to the need for transparency, to be able to easily modify that system as, you know, with feedback. I need to first understand how the AI system is actually understanding what it's actually doing, and me being able to actually, in that interaction, change its understanding, change its operation, and do that in a real-time way, in an effective way, without actually, you know, killing the planet in the process of doing it, right? So it's just, there are so many real challenges there that has to, at the intersection of, you know, AI, at HCI, at cognitive psychology, you know, all of these different fields really need to come together to be able to solve some of these problems. It feels like a daunting task, but on the other hand, if you kind of step back and think about it, many of these constructs are ones that actually are much deeper and span a lot of different use cases, right? To the point that we started this conversation with. If you solve these type of problems, it's not that you're gonna go and utilize it in a retail store and that's where you can utilize it, right? You're utilizing in all type of work that humans can go do in assistance with AI systems. So there's a huge return, but for any one group to be able to do this, it's a huge undertaking. And I think that's where, you know, I mean, now we start to kind of see some of these investments and calls from NSF and DARPA and things like that. And there is, you know, more attention that I'm starting to see in calls around this topic, because it really takes a lot of investment to kind of change or shift towards these type of capabilities that scale much better, and scale meaning to different types of applications and different types of problems.
Yeah, thank you. So for around that research and around the government investment in that, we are getting some questions for Daron about whether there have been precedents of government successfully steering the direction of technological progress. You're referencing the green technology in the Boston Review book, and the criticism that we heard is that, well, thus far there's only 5% of the global energy mix that comes from clean technologies. Is that, should we be put off by that and you know, feel like, you know, it might be futile to try to direct technological progress? What else is needed to direct it?
I think that's a great question, and it's really the crux of the matter. You know, somebody might agree with much of, say, what I have said and Ryan has said, but might conclude that, sure, there are lots of problems, but we can't do anything about it. We can't wean companies from using technology in an exploitative way. We cannot discourage firms from using AI for monitoring, for automation. disagree with that perspective. So let me start with reacting to one thing that Lama said. Yes, I think there are various engineering difficulties in using AI in sort of scaled up and a collaborative manner, but I don't think that it's actually, if you look at it from the point of view of, say, 30, 40 years ago, it was so obvious that AI would go in the direction of going after very narrow tasks and trying to outdo humans incessantly. Actually, the early vision of AI among many of the luminaries was as a human complementary technology, as a tool in the hands of humans. And I think if you look at it, there are many ways in which technologies are actually can be more robust when they work with humans. So I don't think that there is anything technologically so difficult once you sort of ignore the fact that we have put in everything in doing this particular vision of AI over the last 20 years. But technologically, there isn't anything so difficult about doing different things, developing them in different ways. But the biggest barrier to all of these is company incentives and institutional structures. Again, Ryan rightly emphasized the institutions. If you don't protect workers, many companies, not all, many companies are going to use it in order to gain an advantage in terms of labor costs. In the same way, if you continue to subsidize fossil fuels in various ways, I don't find it surprising that a small fraction of our energy in the US, for example, is coming from renewable energy. But on the other hand, it's a glass half full, half empty story. I think it's a tremendous success from the innovation technological point of view that despite all of the things going on in favor of big oil, coal, and sort of the energy sector embedded in fossil fuel, that with minimal subsidies and with minimal consumer pressure, renewable energy has come to cost effectiveness. So if on top of it, US government followed some Scandinavian Nordic countries and had meaningful carbon taxes, today we would see much more than 5% coming from renewable energy. So that really underscores the importance of multi-pronged approach, institutions, pressure, and various policy levers all being used together. But the evidence, I think, is quite supportive of the idea that not just in climate, but in many other areas, when government resources and the focus of scientists go in the direction of trying to do certain things with our knowledge base, we can do it. The best example in the minds of everybody are the COVID vaccines. With the right incentives, there were resources, but most importantly, of course, many scientists rightfully wanted to do something about this terrible pandemic. We have redirected our knowledge and our efforts, and we produced vaccines for COVID from using 3 or 4 different types of technologies in the course of less than a year. When the US started pouring resources into sensors and the internet or the basic computer frames linked to each other for defense and other needs that were then perceived as important by the Department of Defense, again, there were tremendous progress in all of these areas. But I want to add one other element. So government support, that's one prong of the redirection of technological change. Institutional changes, I think that's another prong. But I think social responsibility of companies and researchers is another prong. Ryan mentioned Babbage. Yes, Babbage's vision in some ways was not necessarily very different. He viewed machines replacing tasks by humans. But he, as well as many others at the time, including Lord Byron, understood very well that this actually had distributional consequences. How many of the people who are following on Babbage's footsteps understand and care about that today? Today, Google is a much more important part of the US economy than GM was 40 years ago. At the time, GM employed close to 1 million workers. Today, Google employs something like 80,000 workers. A very different business model. And as long as those business models rule supreme, we could jump up and down and talk about redirecting technological change, but there are going to be big barriers to it. So I think social responsibility, which comes from pressure from society, I think is also critical.
Thank you. And Ryan, you also talk about the need to center worker power in any effort to redirect technological change. So as governments hopefully think about that, as companies think about that, what can we do to ensure that workers are empowered and have not only voice, but a powerful enabled participation in this conversation and in the redirection process? And this is a question we also got from the chat. Are there success cases of creating solid sets of workers' rights that have worked maybe in the United States or around the world that can be learned from?
Mm-hmm. So I think, we can see that in the United States, when workers are unionized and bargaining over these technologies in the workplace, they have made significant gains in some cases. So for example, the Communications Workers of America have, essentially prohibited continuous electronic monitoring of call center workers. In the 1990s, because workers demanded it, they conducted a study, and it showed that continuous monitoring of call center workers who were sort of subjected to some of these technologies very early on, that it caused actual physical injuries as they were at their desks because of the pace of work, and also caused greater anxiety, stress, depression in workers. And so they have negotiated to end those practices. I think that's a success. But in the early 90s, there was a bill, the Consumer and Worker Data Privacy or Electronic Monitoring, I can't remember the exact name, to address some of these concerns. That bill never made it out of committee, but would have eliminated this continuous monitoring for all workers. And I think, so that points to both that workers need power in the workplace, but they also need power at the state and federal level via democratic practice. I mean, right now, corporations have much more power over policy levers than working people. If working people had more power over these levers, then we would see things like electronic monitoring prohibited in workplaces. We would, see misclassification, at-will employment ended. And so we need to have a voice in working people need to have a voice in the policy landscape. I think the Department of Labor could establish a worker committee on technology from workers across sectors, because your first question was sort of like, how do we tell the difference between these technologies? People working in these places know the difference very clearly, and the DOL could be informed by their knowledge, and we could see different sets of regulations come out of that.
Thank you. We've been getting really great questions. Thanks to everyone who submitted them. I'm not going to get through all of them, but let me try to merge a couple and then open it up for just like last remarks from everyone. So one question is, Daron, you called AI potentially becoming the mother of all inappropriate technologies for low and middle income countries. And so the kind of tension that our audience highlights there is, well, there are also just like captured industries that could benefit from some shakeup and disruption, like potentially banking. So how should we balance that? And a related question that we got through Twitter was, should there be an intergovernmental AI controlled organization that is acting internationally to help and to balance out some of the effects, and just like be maybe a global regulator? So for all of you, any thoughts on what would be the dream form of governance for AI, considering the international impacts that it makes?
Well, these are great questions. I'll try to be brief so that others can weigh in as well. Ryan emphasized a very important point. We live in a democratic society, so we have some hope that many different stakeholders, as we all are, from the future of technology, can have a voice through the democratic process. Well, I'm becoming increasingly pessimistic about that, even though I am by disposition an optimist that can happen in the US. And I'm emphasizing it because at least there is some chance that it can happen in the US. But yes, I am much more worried about the rest of the world, because even our democratic processes by themselves are not going to listen to the fate of Nigerian or Indian or Indonesian workers. But if you look at AI, it's an international technology, of course, and it will influence them. And if it goes in a labor-saving direction, the implications for the rest of the world are quite major and dire. If AI goes more and more into automation, it will eat into the main resource that developing countries have, human resources. Until now, every country from what used to be called the third world, when it has grown rapidly, it has done so by using its human resources, by using its labor. But we're going to make that increasingly impossible, because now workers from Indonesia or Mexico will be competing not against well-paid workers in the US, but they're going to be competing against algorithms and machines. So yes, I think that is a real concern, and the distributional and worldwide poverty and welfare implications of that could be multiples of what we see in the US, although I do worry about things in the US as well. That doesn't deny, of course, that AI as a broad technological platform can have other uses that would be very useful. But in all of these cases, I remind you that early optimistic view of what digital technologies are going to do were always dashed. Because AI, just like many other digital technologies, the resources you have really matter. So when digital technologies first started influencing communication, the view among pretty much everybody was that they were going to democratize citizens' journalism, wikis, and everybody's going to be empowered against dictatorships. And look at what happened. It's no contest. It's Russia and China and NSA that have the resources to use those technologies for monitoring individuals, companies that have turned them into complete monitoring systems of their consumers. So I worry that when AI starts influencing other industries, as it will, and has a lot of promise, many times it will be the more powerful actors who will determine how it's used. So again, vigilance is critical. Now, control is not the right word. I don't like the word control when it comes to technology. It makes you think of how in history there has been powerful actors that have blocked technological change. But yes, an intergovernmental, supranational institution that worries about the direction of technological change, especially gives voice to developing countries and their workers, I think is critical. Thank you.
Ryan, Lama, any last
Yeah,
thoughts?
I just I guess 2 words. I mean, I totally agree. I think having some sort of an international organization that, I mean, both for the reasons that Daron mentioned, but also the problem is that we honestly will have to make decisions about places where we don't want to take AI and places where we're going to have to draw the line and say it's not okay to build these things. And unless you have something that spans the globe, it's very hard. It's very hard to then not have that happen, right? So then you always have this race to the bottom, right? Because if you're not doing it, then somebody else is doing it. What does that mean? And how does that then become a tool in the hands of the people that shouldn't be doing it in the first place? So I really don't know how you would solve that without some sort of an international governance.
So I might just add that, you know, right now the EU and the US are primarily determining technology governance, especially internet governance at the moment, themselves, and everybody else is left to play catch up. We also see cases where individual governments take actions that are extremely harmful to their own populations and harmful to technology development around the world. You know, as you see governments use censorship and other systems. And so for that, you know, international bodies have not been hugely successful at managing those power imbalances, but that's certainly a direction that we need to go.
With that, the direction we need to go, this is the place to wrap. Thank you so very much to our panel. Thank you to everyone who sent us questions, to the full steering committee, to the Boston Review, and everyone who joined us this morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for making that hour. If you'd like to continue conversation informally and meet the PI team, please jump on Spatial Chat. Josh posted a link in the chat, so just click on that. And we'll see you in that virtual room. Thank you all so very, very much. It was wonderful to see you all.